Some legacies aren't worn, they're carried in silence. Harrison Ford wasn't invited to the memorial. He didn't expect to be. But when a helicopter tore through the sky above Colorado Springs and a voice called his name over the chaos, everything changed. One line, 7 words. And just like that, the world remembered a man it had tried to forget. Before we begin, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The entrance to the Colorado Springs Air Force Memorial was framed by 2 rows of silver flagpoles, each bearing a branch insignia, fluttering gently in the mountain wind. Beneath them, guests arrived in pressed uniforms and tailored suits, heels clicking against stone tiles, name tags gleaming in the morning sun. Harrison Ford stepped through the outer gate unnoticed. No entourage, no applause. Just a navy jacket zipped up to the collar and a pair of scuffed boots that had seen more gravel than carpet. He approached the check-in table quietly, hands in his pockets. The young woman at the podium scanned the list on her tablet, frowned, then tapped once or twice more before glancing up. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't have a Harrison Ford listed." Her eyes narrowed. "Do you mean Mr. F. Harrison?" She turned the screen around, revealing a line near the bottom. "That's probably you." Ford nodded once. "Probably." She handed him a generic visitor badge, the kind without rank or designation, just a sticker with F. Harrison in block letters. He took it, peeled the back slowly, and pressed it to his jacket like it meant nothing. Maybe it did. Inside, the reception courtyard stretched wide, columns lined with bunting, rows of folding chairs flanking a modest stage. A brass quintet played a muted version of America the Beautiful. Waiters in white jackets passed trays of sparkling cider and shrimp cocktails. Ford made his way along the edge, avoiding eye contact, taking in the rhythm of ceremony. He paused briefly at the memorial wall, where etched names shimmered under soft uplighting. He read them in silence. A voice behind him, young and confident, broke the moment. "Hey, is that Harrison Ford, like the actual actor?" Laughter followed. A group of junior officers clustered near a cocktail table turned to look. One of them, maybe a major judging by the trim, chuckled. "Maybe he's filming Air Force One too. God knows Hollywood loves sequels." Another snapped a picture from behind, not bothering to ask. The screen of his phone glowed with a caption being typed. "Han Solo crashes retirement party." Ford heard it, all of it. He didn't turn around. Just adjusted his collar against the wind and kept walking. He passed a general who looked him over with faint curiosity, then chose not to engage. A reporter standing by the registration tent glanced at Ford, then turned to greet a colonel with a microphone. Cameras pointed the other way. Every gaze moved past him like he was air. He finally stopped at a bench near the edge of the quad, behind a row of bleachers reserved for Gold Star families. From there, he had a clear view of the stage, but none of the stage lights reached him. He sat slowly, hands resting on his knees, the sticker on his chest already peeling at the edge. In another setting, someone might have offered a seat closer. Someone might have said thank you, but here, he was a ghost in daylight, too famous to be anonymous, too misunderstood to be acknowledged. The kind of presence people didn't know what to do with, so they simply chose not to see. But he had come anyway, not for them, not for their chairs or their podiums or their name tags. He watched the flags shift slightly in the wind, his eyes scanning the sky. He wasn't waiting to be recognized. He was waiting for something else entirely. And whatever it was late. The tea reception was held in a glass-roofed hall adjacent to the memorial lawn, where light filtered through flags suspended overhead like faded memories caught midair. A soft murmur hung in the room, the polite hum of officers talking shop, retirees recalling missions, aides checking schedules. Round tables dressed in white linen were arranged in numbered rows. Table 17 sat at the far corner, near the coffee urns and half-empty trays of finger sandwiches. It was the kind of placement you gave to overflow guests, the ones who wouldn't make it into the group photo. Harrison Ford found his name scribbled on a folded paper card. F. Harrison, no title, no affiliation, just a seat. He eased into the chair without a word. To his left, a civilian contractor in a company logo vest scrolled through emails. To his right, two young officers laughed quietly over something on one of their phones. The taller of the two glanced at Ford, then leaned in to whisper with a smirk. "That's him, right? Millennium Falcon guy?" His friend chuckled. "Yeah. Let's just hope he doesn't try to fly anything here. The hangars are full." Their laughter was light, rehearsed, the kind used to pass time between briefings. Ford didn't look at them. A moment later, the taller one stood and without asking raised his phone. "Sorry, sir, couldn't resist," he said, already clicking. Ford looked up as the lens blinked. The screen lit up. A selfie with Ford in the background, gaze unbothered. The caption typed quickly, "Old Han Solo lost in real life." Ford said nothing. He simply reached into his inside jacket pocket and unfolded a small, creased piece of paper. Not a photo, not a script. A hand-drawn map, pencil lines still sharp despite the years, with small red notations written in shorthand only a handful of people would understand. Some of the ink had bled into the paper from time or sweat, but the core markers were intact. A rough perimeter, coordinates, a box circled in silence. He held the map in his palm, not looking at it so much as feeling its weight, the weight of places that didn't exist on tourist maps, of missions that never made headlines, of moments that changed without applause. Across the table, the contractor shifted awkwardly, noticing the paper. "Old document?" he asked. Ford didn't answer. He folded the map again with care, like it might tear if rushed, and slid it back into his pocket. Then he took a sip of lukewarm coffee, eyes still steady, face unreadable. The hall around him moved forward without him. A toast was raised at a distant table. Someone laughed too loud. A photographer snapped a general mid-handshake. At table 17, no one asked for Ford's name. No one noticed the map. But the camera that caught the selfie would later zoom in. And someone, somewhere, would freeze the frame, just enough to ask the question. What was that in his hand? And why did a man dismissed as a faded actor carry battlefield coordinates in his coat pocket? Ford didn't care if they noticed. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to see, and what he saw that day told him the storm hadn't passed. It was just circling quietly, waiting for the sky to break. Behind the hall, past the folding chairs and the decorative hedges, a service path wound toward a maintenance shed rarely noticed by guests. Harrison Ford stood at its edge, half in shadow, where the breeze carried a different kind of quiet. Not ceremonial, not polite, just honest wind moving without purpose. He exhaled slowly, watching the edge of the sky shift color as the sun dipped behind the western hills. He had spent a lifetime in moments like this, between places, between titles, between people who thought they knew who he was. Footsteps approached from gravel, deliberate but unhurried. Ford didn't turn. He already knew the gait. Measured, balanced, not military but adjacent. The kind of walk that belonged to a man who had learned when not to run. "You still draw the weather by scent?" the voice asked quietly. Male, mid-40s, no accent. Ford glanced over. The man wore a brown civilian jacket with a Department of Defense lanyard tucked just below his collar. No name badge, just clearance-level insignia, Level 5, Foreign Liaison Office, or something they called that on paper. Ford raised an eyebrow. "That depends on who's asking." The man offered a faint smile, then dropped it just as quickly. "Orion just lost satellite sync over the Baltic sector. Your blueprint from 7, it's matching the drift vectors." "Exactly." Ford didn't blink. Instead, he pulled from his pocket the same device he'd used maybe twice in the last 5 years. It looked like an old satellite pager, black casing, no brand, one button. When he pressed it, the screen lit blue, then green, then white. Project Orion, threat status, level red, clearance by exception. He stared at it for a moment, then muttered, "I thought they revoked my access." "They did," the man replied. 3 years ago, after Ukraine, new administration wanted everything streamlined." He hesitated. "But today, they sent a request." He held out a small data crystal. The seal etched onto it wasn't military. It was older, intelligence era, back when missions came without names. Ford took the crystal, rolled it between his fingers. "This is real," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. The man nodded. "It's already moving. You remember that airfield you flagged in the northern quadrant?" He paused. It's active again, not on any public satellite, but the heat sigs don't lie. Someone's lighting up that corridor. Ford exhaled through his nose, steady. How long? 30 hours if we're lucky, 18 if they jump early. Ford didn't say anything for a long time. Then, they won't send teams in time. No, that's why they're sending something faster. Ford turned, met the man's eyes fully for the first time. They're sending a drone strike. The man shook his head. They're sending a helicopter with orders to find you. A pause, then softly. This time they want the map, from the one who drew it. Ford looked down at the ground, then at the sky again. They always come back when they run out of options. Yes, sir, and they usually find you where you've always been. Just waiting. Ford smiled, not bitter, just resigned. I'm not enlisted, never was. They know, the man said, but they also know you were never wrong. Ford tapped the screen again. It went dark. The wind picked up just slightly, enough to rustle the corner of the old map inside his jacket. He didn't reach for it. What's the extraction point? He asked. North Lawn, 15 minutes. You'll hear it before you see it. Ford nodded once, then turned back toward the building, not to re-enter, but to retrieve the one thing no one else knew he'd brought, the original sketch. The first draft of Orion, drawn on the back of a diner napkin during a layover 15 years ago. The only version that hadn't been corrupted, digitized, or compromised. The one no system ever registered, because the system never asked the right questions. He hadn't come to be seen. But now, it seemed, the world had remembered what it forgot, and once again, it wasn't his name they needed. It was his mind. The ceremony began with full formality. A brass band played a deliberate march as rows of officers took their seats beneath the canopy. The stage was framed by polished wood and American flags, flanked by towering screens looping tribute reels to decorated service members, past and present. A narrator's voice rolled through the air, solemn and slow, each syllable designed to echo. Harrison Ford stood at the far edge of the lawn, behind a row of ornamental shrubs, unnoticed. His badge still read F. Harrison, barely clinging to his coat, he didn't try to fix it. He didn't move, just watched. A senator stepped to the podium. Applause followed. She spoke of valor, of duty, of those who gave all. Names were read, ranks recited. Photographs flashed in silent cadence. Families held hands. The music paused, then resumed. Flags stirred gently. Everything moved the way ceremonies always moved, controlled, rehearsed, expected, until the sky cracked. At first, it was just a low hum, a sound that barely registered over the speakers. Then it thickened, grew teeth. The hum became a roar, heads turned, the music faltered, wind pressed down like an invisible hand. Guests looked up, squinting against the sun. And then it appeared. A black military helicopter burst over the ridgeline, angular, fast, not part of the program. Its rotors sliced the silence, forcing ties to flap and dresses to twist in the sudden gust. Champagne flutes tipped. Napkins flew. A table umbrella snapped backwards. Voices rose, confused. Security moved, unsure whether to run or salute. The chopper hovered just above the lawn, kicking up leaves and dust in a swirling funnel. Cameras scrambled to adjust. A child screamed. A woman covered her face with a program. And then, slowly, the helicopter began to descend, the beating blades sending a thunderous pulse through the air like the earth itself was bracing for something more than just noise. As the skids hit the grass, the side door swung open. A single figure stepped out, not rushed, not theatrical, just composed. Black boots, regulation cut, full insignia, a folder in his left hand, his eyes locked straight ahead. He walked through the storm of petals and debris like it wasn't there. Straight past the generals, past the photographers, past the podium. The wind howled. The crowd parted. He stopped in front of one man, Harrison Ford. The officer stood firm, raised his chin, and said the words not meant for anyone else, but somehow heard by everyone. Harrison Ford, we need you to come back. The lawn froze. A ripple moved through the crowd, not fear, not awe, something between. Someone near the press row whispered too loudly, "What is happening?" Ford didn't flinch. He looked at the man, then at the helicopter, then back again. "Keep the engine hot," he said calmly. I have to get the map. He turned without explanation, walked toward the hall like he had every right to. No one stopped him. No one dared. The young officers who had mocked him at table 17 stared in disbelief, their mouths slightly open. One dropped his phone. A general adjusted his coat awkwardly. The senator stepped back from the podium, stunned into silence. And for the first time that day, no one tried to take a photo. Because whatever this was, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a cameo. It wasn't a man clinging to nostalgia. It was a return. And suddenly, every person who had looked through him now turned to watch. Not because he had demanded it, but because the sky had broken open, and the world had just remembered who he was. The temporary command post sat atop a high ridge, built into the side of an old Cold War listening station that hadn't been touched in decades. Concrete walls painted with fresh codes, antennas spinning on rusted bolts. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly above rows of tactical screens and operator terminals. There was no glamour here, just urgency, and the low hum of systems that hadn't been turned off in 20 years. Harrison Ford stood in the center of it all, jacket unzipped, hands steady. Before him, a holographic projection flickered against the main wall. It showed satellite relays, signal arcs, and one pulsing red quadrant marked Eastern Europe. The feed skipped every few seconds, distorted, as if something on the other end was listening. A young technician turned toward the officers at the console, Orion's losing integrity across the Baltic line. 3 satellites have dropped to ghost mode, 4ths in flux. Ford stepped closer, tapped a spot with his finger. The map zoomed. They're triangulating through this intake relay near Vilnius. Civilian gateway disguised as telecom infrastructure. He paused. If they breach the convert node, everything from our power grid to air traffic west of the Mississippi goes dark. 36 hours max. A colonel nearby ran his hand over his mouth. That relay was flagged in a handwritten report years ago. He scrolled through a secure index, eyes narrowing, from a civilian submission, no clearance level. It got auto-filtered into the supplemental box. Another man, a comms analyst, spoke without looking up. Yeah, I remember that. Back in 7, came in on paper, folded map, not even emailed. We put it in the Actor Insights folder. Thought it was part of some documentary research. Ford didn't react, just nodded once, quietly. I mailed it because I didn't trust the digital chain. I'd seen what they'd already compromised. His voice wasn't angry. Just warn, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was trying to keep people alive. The analyst looked down, suddenly small beneath the weight of that truth. Another officer stepped forward. Sir, the blueprint you submitted, the one on that map, it matches the current attack vectors better than anything in our system. He hesitated. How did you know? Ford turned to face the room. Because I flew it, not on paper, not in simulation. I flew over that airspace in a relief mission back when no one else could get clearance. Saw the pattern, marked it in pencil, filed it away for when it would matter. He reached into his coat and unfolded the same weathered sheet he'd carried all day. The original map, the one everyone had forgotten, red lines still crisp, symbols hand-drawn with precision no algorithm could replicate. The colonel stepped closer, his voice was low. We laughed about that memo, called it the Indiana Jones report, figured it was fan mail, we were wrong. Ford didn't flinch. I wasn't looking to be believed, just heard. The room fell silent. On the projection wall, another satellite blinked offline. The red zone pulsed again. This time, nobody laughed. Someone tapped into the control board and began inputting the coordinates from Ford's map. The system hesitated for a moment, then adjusted, signal arcs rerouted, pathways cleared, and slowly the breach began to stall. Ford watched without satisfaction, no pride, just a quiet ache in the chest, like something he'd buried had started breathing again. He turned to the officer at the relay station. Tell your team to patch through analog failsafe, split the signal into 7 redundants, do it manually if you have to. The officer nodded. As the room moved around him, Ford stepped back from the light of the screen and into the shadows of the command post. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't wearing a badge. But every person there followed his voice like gravity. They didn't know back then. Now they had no choice. The archive level at the Pentagon wasn't marked by signage, just a long corridor with polished floors and doors that hummed open only after scanning 6 layers of clearance. Harrison Ford stepped through without ceremony, escorted by a junior officer who didn't speak once the entire walk. At the far end, in a temperature-controlled room filled with cabinets that hadn't been touched in years, a woman stood waiting. Grey suit, glasses hung from a chain, she held a slim file in her hands like it weighed more than it should have. Melissa Langley, senior records custodian. She'd been in the system longer than most of the generals upstairs. Ford stopped a few feet away. She didn't offer a greeting, just looked him in the eye and said, "They found this during the Orion cross-reference. Thought you should see it before someone tries to bury it again." She handed him the file. A government issue folder, unremarkable in appearance, but sealed with an old embossed mark, Presidential Commendations Division. Inside, 3 sheets of paper. One was a formal letter of nomination dated February 2008, Presidential Civilian Medal for National Service. The second was a supporting statement from a now-retired NATO general detailing Ford's role in a covert relief flight that diverted a major international incident. The third was a memo, not stamped, just handwritten, in block letters, from an internal review advisor. "Do not proceed. Conflict of public image. Civilian recipient is widely known as a film actor. Risk of misinterpretation. Recommend withdrawal for narrative consistency." Ford read it once, then again, then lowered the paper slowly. "They didn't forget me," he said quietly. "They erased me." Melissa didn't speak, just folded her arms. Her eyes weren't surprised. Just tired. The file had no signature, but at the top corner, a reference code led to a communications office. And from there, a name appeared. Deputy Director of Media Strategy at the time. The same man who had introduced the honorees at the memorial ceremony. The one who had smiled from the stage, microphone in hand, talking about valor and sacrifice. He had once written a memo to protect the narrative. Ford let the folder hang in his hand. His voice was even almost casual. "He's the MC now." Melissa nodded. "He got promoted fast, became the face of defense communications after the Midway broadcast. Built his brand around controlling the message." She paused, "And he made sure yours didn't fit." Ford exhaled, slow, a breath that had been held for years. The room was silent except for the low hum of archived air. He looked at the folder one last time, then slid it onto the table beside him. They didn't want a man who flew through war zones without asking for attention. They wanted someone who could be explained in headlines. They wanted symbols that fit in sound bites, but the map he drew had saved lives, and that wasn't fiction. Ford glanced at Melissa. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded. "I thought you'd be angry." "I'm not," he replied. "I've just been here before." She watched him as he turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Tell them I'm not looking for a medal." "What are you looking for?" she asked. He looked back just once, a clear signal. Then he walked out. And this time, nobody stopped him. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the field where the day's ceremony had unfolded. Most of the guests were already filtering out, shaking hands, taking final selfies, or climbing into transport vans with programmed smiles. On stage, the MC adjusted his lapel mic and signaled toward the crew behind the podium. He was preparing to close, the way he always did, firm voice, practiced cadence, a final line about legacy and light. His voice cleared over the speaker system. Before he could speak, someone moved toward the steps. Harrison Ford. He didn't walk fast, didn't hesitate, just stepped forward from the grass, past the last row of chairs, eyes steady, coat zipped halfway against the breeze. There was no introduction, no program listing. He climbed the stairs alone. The MC looked up, startled. His fingers reached for the console switch at his waist. A young aide in the wings whispered something and reached for the mic channel. But from the back of the crowd, an older man, uniform crisp despite the years, hair silver, posture like stone, spoke clearly, voice unwavering. "Let him speak." The MC froze. The aide stepped back, and for a moment the wind filled in the space where words hadn't yet landed. Ford stood behind the podium. No one had adjusted the mic for him. He didn't need it. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I know I wasn't on today's list," he began, "and I know I'm not the kind of figure this stage was built for." A few heads turned. A few more phones came up. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the weathered piece of paper. The map, creased from time, edges frayed, red lines still visible like scars that never faded. "This," he said, holding it up, "is not a map I drew for attention. It's not a story I ever meant to tell. It's where people almost died, and didn't, because someone looked at this, years later, and listened." He unfolded the map across the podium, smoothing it with his hand. "These red marks, they're not theories. They're places, coordinates, failed fences, compromised nodes. I marked them after flying over ground others had only seen through drones, and I sent them in, without a name, without a title, because I wasn't asking for credit. I was asking for someone to act before it was too late." The crowd was silent now, not frozen, listening. Ford looked up, his gaze sweeping slowly across the field. "I didn't come here to reclaim anything. I came because someone asked me again to help. Same way they did 15 years ago, and the same way they'll do 15 years from now, when the signals jam and the lines blur and nobody knows who to trust." He picked up the map and folded it gently with care. "I don't want medals. I don't need a plaque. I'm not here for a photo op. I just want to make sure the people in this crowd, and the ones who come after you, don't pay the price of silence." He paused, then added quieter, "I did my part. That's all I ever came to do." No music played, no applause followed, just stillness. A long breath seemed to move through the entire space, a pause that said more than cheers ever could. The MC stepped forward slowly, unsure. His eyes flicked down, not in anger, not in defiance. He looked at the man beside him, and for the first time, not as a celebrity or a disruption, but as someone he had once tried to erase. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke. "I was wrong." Ford didn't respond. He didn't need to. He stepped down from the stage, and every person standing there made room for him, not out of instruction, but instinct. Sometimes the loudest truth is the one spoken with no permission, and the deepest respect is the kind that doesn't need a sound. The bronze plaque had been added quietly, no ribbon cutting, no press release. Just a new square affixed to the outer wall of the memorial, polished to a soft shine, catching the morning light through the trees. It sat between two kernels, beneath a quote about sacrifice, and above a row of red poppies placed by an unseen hand. Visitors walked past without noticing at first, their eyes drawn to the more familiar names, the ranks, the medals. But then someone paused. A young cadet, uniform crisp, backpack still slung over one shoulder. She tilted her head, reading slowly, "Harrison Ford. He never wore a rank, but he always showed up." She stood there longer than most, not in awe, in recognition. Her fingers traced the edge of the plaque. The metal was still warm from the sun. A friend behind her called out, but she didn't move. "He's the reason I applied," she whispered. Across the country, the wind moved over snow and pine as a single-prop plane banked low over a frozen ridge. In Alaska, at a volunteer-run flight camp, a handful of trainees in oversized jackets stood watching a figure explain pressure changes using a beat-up clipboard and a patched fuel gauge. Harrison Ford pointed to a diagram scratched into the snow with a stick. His voice was calm, his hands steady, no fanfare, just a lesson. He finished the explanation and handed the controls to a younger pilot, motioning toward the sky. She climbed into the cockpit, nerves showing behind her goggles. Ford gave a small nod, then stepped back to let her rise. Inside his coat, a soft chime echoed from a secure device tucked near his ribs. He pulled it out without drama. The screen lit blue, one line of text, "Threat neutralized, legacy confirmed." Ford read it once, then powered the device down, no reply needed. He looked up at the horizon. The girl's plane had lifted, tracing a clean line through the cold morning air. Her trajectory was smooth, confident. He said nothing. Back at the memorial, a small group had gathered around the plaque now. The young cadet hadn't moved. A few older veterans nodded slowly, as if remembering something they hadn't realized they'd forgotten. Not every name on a wall is followed by rank or ribbons. Some carry more than that. Some refuse to vanish. And some become the reason others take flight. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.